I think Shifley may have cursed the Winnipeg Jets in every game going forward against the Toronto Maple Leafs. Find out why on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, originally I was going to talk about the Flames game, but seeing as how the Jets just finished a very topsy-turvy game against Toronto, I want to spend this evening chatting about this game, and I think this might actually be one of the most frustrating games I've ever watched the Jets play for a lot of reasons. And I want to spend some time diving into each of these different parts because I think this particular game showed some real promise for the Jets, but also some real problems with how this team is managed and where there are some real glaring weaknesses for Winnipeg to work on. I would have been fine with this loss if the Jets had kind of just been dominated the whole way through. But I think it's actually more frustrating that there were some changes and adjustments made that looked really good. And then in the very dying minutes, the Jets went away from it. So we'll get to that in just a quick moment. But before we start ranting and raving, did want to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Now, like I just said, this Jets game, I would argue, was one of the most frustrating and exciting, and I guess all of these different emotions wrapped in together. Obviously, I alluded to Mark Scheifele having cursed the Jets ever since he said, what's better than beating the Leafs? Well, we actually haven't beaten the Leafs, so maybe we should have just never said anything about it. That being our Stanley Cup, I guess, is not great. And that's always going to hang over our heads. And now the Jets have not actually beaten Toronto since then. Very annoying, very frustrating that this continues to happen against this team. I think we would all love the Jets to actually beat Toronto, but it hasn't happened for a while. So, unfortunately, that is just bulletin board material, which is sort of funny because Toronto has a significantly worse record than we are, or than the Jets have. But, here we are sitting, after a really disappointing 6-4 loss. And, for about 2/3 of this game, the Jets were basically not in it. Winnipeg, frankly, got embarrassed. I will be blunt. Almost every single player on this team really struggled. The only guy who I thought really showed up from puck drop was Hellebuck. And he did about as much as he could and really didn't have any support. If we're talking about players who I think massively struggled, Sandberg and Pionk probably had some of their worst games as Jets ever, which, is saying something because, Pionk has had some rough outings, but between him and Sandberg, it just seemed like every time they touched the puck, something went horribly wrong. DeMello really struggled. Stanley had a really bad game. Really, for the most part, it was hard to find anyone, at least in the skater side, that actually had strong outings. I think Kyle Connor actually had a pretty nice night. Unfortunately, he got a hat trick robbed of him thanks to a Gabriel Velarde deflection, but he has consistently been one of the few players that I think, for the most part, has really showed up almost every game, even when his line mates maybe haven't been as good. But, I got to say, from Mark Scheifele, man, I really expect more. I don't mean to, sit here and criticize individual players, but I really felt like in a lot of this game, Scheifele just didn't have it. And I don't know if he's just wasn't feeling it or what, but I was really disappointed in what felt like a very half-hearted game from him, especially for a guy who I know has the ability to really dominate proceedings and be a phenomenal player. I just didn't see it. And for a good portion of this game, Ehlers was awful too. I was really frustrated with Nick. Lots of really bad turnovers, tons of mistakes and things. I don't know. it was really rough. And I was frustrated, but then about, I don't know, a minute or so into the last few seconds of, or last dying embers of the second period, the Jets started making some changes to the lines. And at first they were like all over the place. Niederreiter, Scheifele, and Velarde, which just didn't really make sense to me. But then, at the start of the third period, Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde were reunited. Connor, Lowry, and Perfetti were put together, and the Jets started to take over the game. And would you believe it, the Ehlers, Scheifele, and Velarde line actually drew 2 penalties. They scored a goal on the delayed call, and then, not long after that, on a near goalie pool, Winnipeg ended up scoring another goal thanks to, having an extra man with Connor coming on. And it just seemed like all of the tempo of the game changed. Obviously score effects is a thing where the Jets are, certainly trailing, and Toronto doesn't feel the need to put the pedal to the metal the whole way through. But by the same token, the Jets were actually starting to claw back into it. They had some power play goals. The lines were suddenly starting to cook. And then the most frustrating thing happened where, with just like 2 or 3 minutes left in the period, with the game really on the line, and, the Jets only trailing 5-4, they went back to the same frickin' lines that got them in the original hole. They were down 4-0 by like the second period. And I sit there and I'm just so confused as to how to, you can take over a game and actually have a real chance. And it came from your direct line combinations. And then you go back to what didn't work before. And I don't understand. Why would you do that? Why would you change things that were working, to go back to the original line combinations that were getting dumped on? Toronto had a field day against us. And then, as soon as the Jets went back to those lines, and they pulled the goalie, of course, they didn't get zone possession. And, there was an easy empty netter. And for me, it was really frustrating because I could see a glimmer of hope, and then just like that, it was snatched away. And I don't think I necessarily care specifically about the loss. I really hate the philosophy of doing this. If you're going to make a change like this, stick with it. Don't just suddenly change it at the last second because you want to go back to the original lines. If you are this close and if things are really coming through, why not just go with it? I don't understand. What is the thinking in making this change? And I know Arniel, is going to try and, keep as much as he can together with some of these line combinations and keep the chemistry going. But I was baffled. I felt like that was a very poor tactical choice, and Winnipeg almost immediately got punished for it. And from Arniel's press conference, I didn't really hear what I needed to hear from him. So I'm very frustrated. I think that this is one of the more frustrating losses because there were legitimate signs of progress in decision-making that I thought Arniel should absolutely be praised for. Some of the tweaks and stuff that he made in the third period got the Jets so close, and then they undid all of it at the very end, and I don't understand why. Why would you do this? I'm still baffled. It's even more frustrating than just getting blown out, period, because you were right there. You were so close. And I actually think the Jets had a real chance to tie it if they had just stayed the course and continued on. And no guarantee that it would have happened, and they probably still would have lost if we're being honest. But at least you give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. Maybe there's a chance. If the Jets do all this stuff and things don't work, then fine. Go back to what you were doing before that also wasn't working, and just hope that your power play and stuff carries you. That's fine if there's no other alternatives, but I know for a fact the Jets have had some combinations that have worked better than others, and I'm just puzzled as to why, when things were, really not going well in this game, the Jets got away from some stuff that clearly started showing signs of progress. And I really want to talk about some very puzzling decisions, from the coaching staff on some of the line combinations and stuff in a little bit, because I think this is a bigger problem that I've really been alluding to the last few weeks. And I know that the record looks really good on paper, but I think how the Jets are getting there are some flags that things are not 100% the way that you'd like them to be. So I will chat about that in just a quick minute. But before we go too much further, did want to shout out our friends and partners at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action, and with over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to everyone. You just pick more or less on at least two players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. PrizePicks allows you to do things like have a flex play, which means you can still cash out if your lineup isn't perfect. That also includes injuries, right? If somebody dips out at halftime, maybe they tore something. Lord knows injuries are extremely common these days. You don't have to worry. PrizePicks keeps your lineup live, so you still get in on the action. And if you happen to win big and you want your money fast, well, PrizePicks always puts their members first. All withdrawals are fast, safe, secure, and you get your money in as little as 15 minutes, which is pretty dang awesome if you ask me. When you sign up today, you'll even get $50 instantly when you play $5. You don't even need to win to receive that $50 bonus. It's just guaranteed. If you're thinking about upcoming games, maybe you think the Jets are going to score, more than 3.5 goals against Detroit this coming Wednesday. I think that might be a little ambitious given some of Winnipeg's uneven offense. But then again, with all the frustration of losing to Toronto the way that they did, maybe this is going to be a big revenge game and the Jets start another win streak. Either way, though, to get started, download the app today and be sure to use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Hey friends, and welcome back to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about, what's been an interesting start to the season. Winnipeg finally has its first loss of the year, and if you heard me kind of semi-ranting against some of the decisions made in this game, you can probably guess what I'm going to say about the line combinations. It's stuff that I've said for a while, and people get mad at me and they call me a broken record. They say I keep focusing on the top line, and games like this show why I'm right. I hate to say it, but I was right about this stuff. Connor, Scheifele, and Velarde as a line really haven't worked well. And in games in which you're facing a really aggressive pressure like Toronto did in this game, it's really important that you can skate the puck up the ice into your opponent's end. And a lot of these lines, the way that they're constructed, struggle to do that, especially if Toronto starts maybe double teaming and overloading the puck side. Like the Jets just didn't have an answer for that. And I feel like the moment that Ehlers moved up to the top line and swapped with Connor, there was an immediate difference in their ability to transition. And I get that Ehlers had a really crappy game, and I do agree to some extent that I don't know that he really deserved a promotion, but for me it was in this moment about sparking the offense with a line combination that will control 5v5 play. And as soon as those guys were together, it was like a totally different experience. That third period was way more fun. The Jets generally controlled proceedings, and they got themselves this close to tying the game. And I just sit there and I wonder, this past offseason, the Jets really emphasized the idea of being more data science oriented, using a lot more information to make decisions. And it feels like only some of that is actually trickling into the lineup decisions. And so, my question is, how much of this information are they really using? And are they just disagreeing with it? What information is relevant to them? What are they seeing? And is it also a question of HR stuff? Is Scheifele, partly dictating who he plays with? How is that all panning out? Because I feel like if there are major personalities that are prohibiting Arniel from doing his job, then that is a locker room issue and really a management problem, right? If there are things that he has to consider in that respect, and that's keeping him from making the best lineups available, then I would take issue with that and I would move the blame somewhat away from Scott, because that's not something that he necessarily has as much authority with if some of that connection goes a bit above his pay grade. So, in that respect, I can see why that might be, a big explanation for Scheifele maybe not playing with Ehlers. But I also look at the body of evidence where Mark just excels alongside Nick, and I ask myself, why do we not go back to this? Why aren't we even trying it? It worked really well in samples last year. It's looked really good this year. You compare at least even just from like a base goal differential thing, like the Connor Scheifele and Velarde line is like a -8 or a -9 together at even strength. Sure, they will score tons on the power play and stuff, and I think that that's great. That's where they really work well, is when they have time and space. But the moment that they play at even strength, it's a very different story. And you might say, why are you focusing on this? Well, it has downstream impacts. All of the other matchups are much harder if the top line is not winning its own. And even if they're just playing at like an average level, that's probably not good enough. The second line with Nemesnikov was horrendous for most of this game. Nemesnikov looked overwhelmed. Ehlers was just all over the place. Perfetti wasn't really much of a factor. And even the Lowry and Kupari lines really weren't able to do much of anything. They all really struggled. And, if you don't have a top line that's able to start, carrying the game by the bit and dragging this team into success and a bit of a rhythm, you're never going to be able to actually win games in the playoffs. And I think that that's really my overarching frustration, is I can see where this road is going. It's not because I'm not willing to give it time. It's that I've seen the Jets do this multiple seasons in a row. It'd be one thing if there was no evidence that, how the Jets are arranged is poor, right? But we have a fair bit of evidence going from multiple years now of how this Jets team plays when it actually gets into the playoffs and what specific combos just don't work. Connor and Scheifele together, not great unless you have Ehlers with them. And even then, they're usually more break-even. We also know that Perfetti and Ehlers together, they can be a little mixed. They might outshoot the opponent, but in terms of getting into those really gritty, dangerous areas, it's been a struggle with him. And Nemesnikov hasn't really been able to keep up on a consistent basis. So, those frustrations are certainly there. Then you've got the decision to keep playing Stanley against teams that are fast and aggressive. And like Stanley, I don't mind coming in from time to time, but in games like these where you actually need a mobile two-way blue liner, I know that Hayden Fleury is maybe not the sexiest name out there, but I feel like Fleury and Miller probably would have been a lot more stable tonight. And with Sandberg and Pionk doing so poorly and Stanley really not doing any better, you basically came down to Morrissey and DeMello being the only pairing that you could technically trust. And that pairing was bad too. There was no D pairing that worked particularly well. And so for me, I don't understand some of the decision making here. And it's been a long running problem with this team. It's not a new occurrence. And I don't know how long, the Jets can keep getting away with this stuff. I know that this is the first loss that they've had, but I think if we're being truly honest, the Jets probably could be closer to 500 were it not for some really fortunate bounces or some individual talent in the special teams really carrying this team to, an 8-1-0 record. Let's be honest, right? The Jets' power play in PK has been really good, and it's pushed the Jets a lot further along than their 5v5 offense has. But when it gets to the playoffs, what do you think you're playing at for the most part? It's 5v5, even strength play. And so I don't want to belabor this and hammer home to the point of just beating you senseless, but I think it comes back to, thinking about not only the short term, but the longer term. The trend eventually catches up to you, and it's not always your friend. I know people say that as a figure of speech, but I think in Winnipeg's case, the trend has been a bit of a problem because it usually paints the Jets as a more pedestrian team in some really critical categories versus a lot of the top contenders. And some of this is out of Winnipeg's hands, right? They're not going to have access to every single elite game-breaking talent that some of these other teams do. But if you already know that you have some lines that can at least win their matchups and help make everyone else's lives easier, and you start winning by committee, I think that that's a fairly fantastic approach for a team like the Jets. They've proven that in 2017, 2018, it nearly took them to a cup. They were this close, and it was just a really hot, Marc-Andre Fleury that really stopped the Jets cold. And so for me, I don't understand how we keep, running in circles around the same problems over and over again. And I'm really hoping and crossing my fingers that Arniel, kind of turns it around, because I think he is more open-minded, and he's certainly said the right things over the past few months. He's made some lineup choices in game that appear to be more like what you would want him to make, but I want him to actually commit to it. We've already given Connor Scheifele Velarde a ton of chances. They've been okay at best, but they're rocking a really ugly even strength goal differential. I think Arniel was actually irritated being asked about it in this game. Somebody, towards the tail end of his press conference directly asked him about that line, and he didn't seem thrilled. So I suspect that he sees all the same things that we do, but he also has to manage some delicate relationships and balance those carefully, more so than, just the hockey side. So I totally appreciate and understand that, but at some point, someone's going to have to step up for this team and make some changes, because as it is right now, the Jets, they're just not really dominating opponents the way that I believe they can. I think that they've come a really impressive way with their record, but I think the way that they've actually gotten there is a little more disconcerting. This team is not built to be a truly elite contender, and unless they make some of these changes that, the Jets, that I've been advocating for the Jets and maybe some others have as well, I feel like we're going to end up in the same place that we always do, where it's a really short playoff experience and, you're one and done, you're back into the offseason, and we spend months waiting for Jets hockey to return only to be, disappointed again when the season beyond the regular season is extremely short. I just want to watch more playoff hockey, and I feel like, it's not too much to ask this team to go deeper, and I feel like they're always so close to figuring it out, but it just doesn't seem like they quite close the gap. So some real frustrations there, but, it is what it is. At the end of the day, I can only scream at the sun, I guess, and sort of wave my hand and fist. But, I'd be curious to know what you think. If you guys are sharing some of these same frustrations, drop those in the comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets on X/Twitter. Now, the last topic for tonight is really to talk about the Stanley experiment and why it probably needs to end. This is no shocker. You probably have a pretty good understanding of where I'm going with this. We will chat about the Stanley parable in just a brief moment. Before we go any further, though, I did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with America's #1 sportsbook at FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. You can even check stats in the middle of the game, live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. It's especially helpful when you're getting a hunch in the middle of the game, and maybe you're a Ravens fan and you're thinking, this next AFC North champion or AFC North matchup is going to go poorly like it did against the Browns. Or maybe you think that they're going to recover form and actually beat the Broncos. They always do well out of division, so I guess that's a thing for me at least, to cling to. Maybe you're a Vikings fan and you're hoping they rebound after a tough outing this past weekend. But no matter what, FanDuel still wants to help you have fun and enjoy yourself. So visit FanDuel.com to join today. And again, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's all with FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're just wrapping up with a few thoughts. Tonight was, I would say, one of the most frustrating games that I've seen the Jets play, not because they were bad for the whole part, but because they were really close to being, close in this game and almost there, and then they seemingly undid their progress. But one thing that I think handcuffed the Jets almost from, the start of the game was to dress Logan Stanley again. And I get having Stanley in as a big physical presence on the back end, but I think we've all kind of seen that Stanley as a blue liner isn't really a guy who's in most starting lineups, especially if they're a contender. Stanley is tall, he's a fairly good skater, and he can pull off some really nice offensive moves, but for the most part, his defensive game, especially when under pressure, it just ain't working. He's passing the puck into danger. He gets himself into trouble. And when an opponent has an inside step on him, it's no contest. He's already lost the foot race. And so, I think in limited minutes, it's fine. But in a game like this, where all of your deep pairings are getting caved in, you'd like to be able to pull on maybe, a little bit more out of your third pairing or something to maybe eat some of those minutes. And I think Stanley kind of prohibits the ability to do that. And, for the Jets, it just having Logan in already makes part of their blue line suspect. I hate to put it in those terms, but as much as, we may talk about other players on this team. With the Jets blue line, there's really not a lot of margin for error. If you have 2 or 3 pairings that just aren't doing that well, then, you're really cooked. It makes everything else very challenging. And even with the Jets having a fairly strong defensive structure as a team, it's not going to matter if the skaters themselves aren't capable of actually executing it. And in a game like this, where, Pionk had one of the worst outings of his career, and Sandberg was somehow even worse, it's just one of those games where you really would have liked to have had a Hayden Fleury to maybe eat some extra minutes, and instead you had Stanley, who wasn't really able to do much in his time. And in fact, he mostly got pressured. He made a lot of turnovers. And so I think at some point the Jets need to admit that, the draft pick when they got him really wasn't the right choice. They've got to cut their losses at some point. He can't keep doing the same things over and over again when we all kind of know how it's going to end. There are times where Stanley will pull off some really nice breakout passes, and he had one, a great one, I think, to Scheifele this evening. That was fantastic to see. But on the same wavelength, he's also passing to his opponents and getting himself into trouble in previous games. And so, for me, I think the Jets need to, admit that he wasn't the right choice and to not let sunk cost fallacy really drive their decision to keep playing him. Fleury Miller did fine. Like, I wouldn't really want Fleury to be in a playoff lineup necessarily, but in, the emergency situation where the Jets don't have Heinola and are down some blue liners, bring him back. I feel like Fleury was more than capable of playing alongside Colin, and they actually had a fairly decent performance together. I would expect them actually to be together this coming Wednesday. I think at this point, it wouldn't shock me if the Jets bench Stanley for a game, because he was just not particularly great. I think I would be more frustrated if they benched Sandberg. Like, I get Sandberg having like the worst game of his career, but he's also been such a stable rock for the Jets until this point. And I don't think one game for me is enough to really want to set him aside and have him sit. Stanley, we kind of know, is a recurring issue, and it's not new. It's not like it's a sudden thing with him. You know where he's going to be strong, and you know where he's going to have some real deficiencies. And in where he's weak, the Jets unfortunately aren't able to compensate and don't have the luxury of doing so. Every time you have a weak link on this team, it gets, kind of exaggerated by the Jets not having the top end talent across the board that everyone else does. So, as much as I really appreciate Stanley's work ethic, and, he's a guy who really fights for this team, and I really respect that, I just think the results aren't there, and I don't think they ever will be. As much as it would have been nice if he'd panned out as, a solid third pairing guy, unfortunately, Stanley just hasn't really been able to put it all together. And I think games like these where, you need a few extra shifts out of him and you really can't get them, it's unfortunate. But, I look at the coaching staff and the front office, and this is kind of their call. They have to really make hard decisions, and I think at some point this is going to be one of them. That extension in the offseason I knew was probably going to be an issue for the season, and unfortunately it does seem like that's already starting to rear its head. But, it is what it is. Every team kind of does this stuff. I just wish the Jets would maybe try to get away from it, because Winnipeg's not in a position where they can afford, players who are falling behind everyone else. They just don't have that luxury. They don't even have an elite number one center. And when you're factoring all of that in and how the Jets have to win games, it's not necessarily something where you think it's going to be sustainable doing it like this. So might be time to cut bait and make room for maybe an acquisition on the blue line. I don't know. It is what it is. But curious to know your thoughts on this. Are you still hoping the Jets give Stanley a chance? Let me know what you're thinking about Winnipeg's defensive progress so far in the comments below, or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that is going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with more Jets coverage of the game over this past weekend. But like I said, that's all the time that we have tonight. As always, thanks for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.